You have probably watched someone go through something that made no sense, not someone who made a long series of bad choices and ended up exactly where those choices were pointing. Someone genuinely good, someone who showed up for people, who lived with honesty, who prayed and actually meant it. And what happened to them had no explanation that fit. No lesson you could point to from the outside, nothing that added up. And somewhere in watching that, or maybe in going through something like it yourself, a question formed that you may never have said out loud in a church setting, because it did not feel like the kind of question you were supposed to ask there. Why would God let that happen to someone who did nothing to deserve it? That question is not a sign of weak faith. It is one of the oldest questions in human history. And there is an entire book of the Bible that exists specifically to sit with it, not to resolve it cleanly, not to explain it away, to sit with it honestly, at full weight, without rushing to a conclusion that makes everyone feel better before they have actually felt the difficulty. Most people know Job as a story about a man who suffered and eventually got everything back. That summary is not wrong, but it misses what the book is actually doing. Because the most important thing in the book of Job is not the suffering, and it is not the restoration at the end. It is a conversation that happens before any of it begins. One that Job himself never knew about, never had access to, and was never told. In the first chapter, before anything bad has happened, there is a scene in heaven. God and Satan are in conversation, and God brings up Job's name, not Satan. God. God is the one who says, "Have you noticed this man? He is completely honest, completely faithful. There is nobody quite like him on earth." Think about that for a moment. It was not that Satan went looking for a righteous man to destroy and stumbled across Job. God pointed to him. God initiated the conversation that set everything in motion. The man described in that same sentence as completely blameless was the one God drew attention to. That is the line I want you to sit with, because it is the most uncomfortable line in the entire book. Not the disasters that follow, not the grief, not the silence. The fact that God pointed first. I have no tidy explanation for why God did that. The text does not offer one, and I think that is deliberate, because the book of Job is not trying to explain why suffering happens to good people. If that were its goal, it would be a much shorter and much more satisfying book. It is trying to do something harder and more honest than that. Now here is the detail that I find most important when I read this story. Job never knew about that conversation. He had no access to it. He did not know he had been pointed to, did not know there was any larger context for what was unfolding in his life. All he knew was that everything he had built and everyone he loved had been taken from him in rapid succession, and that when he cried out, the silence on the other end was deafening. So when Job starts arguing, and he argues loudly and at length across most of this book, he is arguing from inside a situation whose full picture had never been shown to him. He is in the middle of a story he was never given the first chapter of. Everything he says, every accusation, every demand for an explanation, every moment of what sounds like someone at the edge of their rope, comes from a man doing his honest best to make sense of something he was never given the tools to make sense of. Most of us know what that feels like. We go through things whose full context we do not have. We experience loss, silence, prayers that seem to land nowhere, situations that make no proportional sense, and we do our best to understand what God is doing based entirely on what we can see from inside it, which is, by definition, incomplete. Job was in exactly that position, and the book does not treat his honest confusion as a failure. It treats it as a human being responding truthfully to a genuinely difficult situation. 3 of Job's friends come to be with him, and they do something quietly remarkable at the beginning. They sit with him in silence for a full week. No explanations, no theology, no attempts to fix what cannot be fixed. Just presence. That is the most useful thing they do in the entire story. Then they start talking, and what they say, though it comes from a place of genuine care, follows a logic that feels very familiar. Suffering is the result of something wrong. If your life is falling apart, something in you is the reason. Find it, confess it, correct it, and things will improve. Their arguments are not malicious. They are trying to help Job find a lever he can pull to change his situation. But the framework underneath everything they say is that the world works according to a simple equation. Good behavior produces good outcomes, and suffering is always a signal that something needs to be fixed in the person experiencing it. Job pushes back against this for 37 chapters. He is not polite about it. He says things to God that would make most people in a Sunday morning service deeply uncomfortable. He accuses God of hiding, of not answering, of what feels from his vantage point like a profound injustice. He is not performing faith. He is not saying what he thinks he is supposed to say. He is telling the truth about his experience with everything he has. And then at the end of the book, God speaks directly to Job's friends. And what he says is striking. He tells them that they have not spoken rightly about him, unlike Job, who did. Not that Job had all the right answers, not that every argument Job made was theologically precise, but that Job, in his raw and sometimes furious honesty, was closer to speaking truthfully about God than the friends who had defended God's reputation with clean formulas that avoided the actual weight of what Job was going through. That says something important. It suggests that honest struggle, the kind that does not clean itself up before bringing itself to God, the kind that says this does not make sense and I need you to show up, is something God regards differently than we often expect. The friends chose theological tidiness. Job chose honesty. And God said Job was the one who spoke rightly. Now I want to talk about what happens when God finally answers, because it is not what most people expect, and understanding it changes everything about what the book is trying to offer. God speaks to Job out of a storm in chapter 38, and instead of answering any of Job's questions, God asks his own. Where were you when the foundations of the earth were laid? Have you walked in the depths of the ocean? Do you know where light comes from, or where darkness goes? Can you bind the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion? Question after question, none of them rhetorical in a dismissive way, but all of them pointing to the same thing, the vastness of what God is holding together that Job has never seen and cannot fully comprehend, not as a way of humiliating Job, as a way of reorienting him, of showing him the scale of what he has been demanding an explanation from. And something shifts in Job. Not because God answered his questions. God never answered his questions. Not because the suffering was explained. It was not. But Job says something in response that I find remarkable. He says, I had heard about you, but now my eyes have seen you. The encounter with God's presence, even without a single explanation, produces something in Job that 37 chapters of argument could not. I want to be honest about what that means and what it does not mean. It does not mean the suffering did not matter. It does not mean the questions were wrong. It does not mean that if you are in genuine pain right now and God feels absent, you simply need to wait for a moment of encounter and everything will feel resolved. The book of Job does not promise that. What it shows is that Job found something in the direct experience of God's presence that was more substantial than the answer he had been demanding. Not instead of the answer. He still never got the answer. But something that, for Job in that moment, was enough to move him from argument to silence. From, I need an explanation, to I have seen something I cannot fully put into words. Whether that is satisfying to you right now, and whatever you are carrying, is not for me to say. The book does not force that conclusion on anyone. What it does do is refuse to offer you the comfortable alternative, the idea that suffering always has a tidy reason you can find if you look hard enough, or that God always explains himself to the people he loves, or that faithfulness is a guarantee against the kind of losses Job experienced. Job was pointed to by name. He was blameless. He lost everything. And the book that tells his story ends not with an explanation of why, but with a man who encountered something in God that turned out to be more than he knew how to ask for. If you are in the middle of something right now, whose chapter 1 has never been shown to you, if you are arguing, confused, somewhere between faith and honest frustration, I want you to know that the oldest piece of wisdom literature in the Bible has room for exactly where you are. Job argued for 37 chapters, and God called it right speech. You do not have to clean up your questions before you bring them. Leave a word in the comments that describes where you are with this today. Just one word. I will read every one of them. Subscribe if you want to keep reading scripture this way, slowly, honestly, without forcing it to say more than it says. And press like so that someone else who is in the middle of a chapter 2 with no access to chapter 1 can find their way here.